There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between radio and bar talk, between commentary and recaps, and it lies between the pit of man's Netflix subscriptions and the summit of his binge-watching ability. This is the dimension of podcasting and the Twilight Zone. These are the Zone-i-Sodes. And now your hosts, Brandon Davis and Scott McFarland.
Hello right there, podcast land. Welcome to the Front Row Movie Reviews. This is another episode of Zone-i-Sodes. Today we are taking a look at Third from the Sun. Not Third Rock from the Sun. That comes a little later. We're looking at Third from the Sun. I'm Scott McFarland, and with me is...
Brandon Davis, your classics host.
Yes. I just finished the 90s NIT bracket where Jeremy completely ruined the 90s for me in one vote. But you'll have to go check out that podcast when it drops. It actually will drop after this one. So we're looking at Third from the Sun. I'll go ahead and do a little synopsis for it real quick, and then we'll roll into what Rod had to say and from there. Sure. So Will Sturka is a scientist working for a military base. He's working for the Ministry of Science, which is an interesting way of calling it that, but that's what the sign says, Ministry of Science. And he is working with every nasty thing you can think of in warfare. He's working on the nuclear side. There's another guy working on bioterrorism, another guy working on germ warfare, and it's just all the nasty stuff you can think of. And they're working at a power plant. Just take that as you will. Sturka believes that everyone is working around the clock on all of these deadly weapons because their country is about to go to war, and that war will end everything on the planet. So he works with another one of his friends. I forgot his name.
Jerry?
Yeah, Jerry.
Yeah.
It's 10 o'clock at night. Working with Jerry, who happens to be a test pilot for a flying saucer. Jerry and Sturka work to get their families to the flying saucer, but unfortunately, one of his superiors, Carlene, overhears everything and decides to stop them and turn them into the authorities. Luckily, Sturka's wife stops Carlene from stopping the families as they go to the flying saucer, and they're able to escape the planet and travel 11 million miles away to a planet that they had heard communication coming from that sounded an awful lot like their language of choice. And as we end, we find out that they are heading towards the third planet from the sun, Earth. Brandon, what does Rod have to say?
Quitting time at the plant. Time for supper now. Time for families. Time for a cool drink on a porch. Time for a quiet rustle of leaf-laden trees that screen out the moon, and underneath it all, behind the eyes of the men, hanging invisible over the summer night, in a horror without words. For this is the stillness before storm. This is the eve of the end.
It's the eve of destruction. I need to sing with a raspy voice, though. It's the eve of destruction. So, Brandon, what are your first reactions to Third from the Sun?
Well, I was going to say, the 90s were ruined for you, so let's go back to the 60s a little bit. And but
the very early 60s. We're looking at one from January 8th, 1960.
Yes. So this is pre-Kennedy. So
definitely pre-Bay of Pigs and pre-Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah. This was one of the episodes I had not seen, and I was really taken by it from the very beginning. I like the whole setup, the way this episode is shot, and the way the way the suspense builds and everything. And even though the title being Third from the Sun, for some reason I wasn't thinking about the Earth thing at the very end. The whole twist at the end with them coming to Earth. But I think it's a very smartly written, smartly directed episode. I also really like the performance of Fritz Weaver as Will Sturka. He has a great presence about him, and he's the hero of this episode. But there's a little bit of world weariness to him that I think is really good, and doesn't date the episode at all. And I think overall it's a very, very solid outing for a first season episode.
Yeah, this one isn't in rotation that much, so I'm not surprised you haven't seen it. I've only seen it a couple times, to a point where I had forgot the twist for most of it.
Yeah.
I was trying to I knew there was going to be a twist. It's the Twilight Zone. But I was trying to figure out for a while what that twist was going to be. And then when they get to the flying saucer and they're at the gate and it says Ministry of Science, I was like, well, this isn't the United States, because what the heck is the Ministry of Science? And I was like, oh, they're the aliens. I got it. Okay. But for most of the episode, I didn't remember. I think this is an excellent time capsule for the 60s. But when you've already said, it really is very much the early 60s, and it's before we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So obviously the Cold War is very much going. The USSR has shown off its power to do nukes for quite some time. We've had issues in Korea, obviously, and so forth and so on. So there already is a fear of nuclear war, World War III. But I still think this is a little ahead of its time, because the scary part of the Cold War is still a few years off. I also like the direction of this a lot. I mean, everything is shot in Dutch angle, and it just makes you feel like you're just ill at ease. The music is very foreboding. Everyone looks scared. And so when Carling shows up and he is just kind of an aloof, bureaucrat, you get scared of the guy just because you know he's up to no good. And it's a very very well shot, well acted episode. It's a good story, and for many reasons, it still holds up to this day. Yeah, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end too.
Well, and we pointed out too that this is before the whole Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs stuff. So I think had this episode been made a couple years later, it might have been a little more specific to what was going on at the time. But since that's why it doesn't date to me. I feel like I think you can kind of put it in any era, especially talking about what's going on now, with Korea and everything. It sort of fits in whatever era you want to talk about where there's been nuclear scares.
Yeah, and they do throw the kitchen sink at you. It's not just nukes; it's germs. There's a couple other ones listed. Like, they just kind of go through the gamut of every kind of war crime you can think of. So I think it was Rod trying to kind of point out that one way or another, these guys are going to kill themselves. We're not entirely sure how they're going to kill themselves, but they're going to kill themselves. And that's a good setup, because for the rest of the episode, the foreboding is there to a point where Carling even says, I think in the next 48 hours, this is going to happen. So it's very close. And so when Struka's wife is serving the lemonade and she's shaking, and it's just well acted all around.
I love the whole scene where they're playing cards and the camera is looking up from the bottom of the glass table.
There's a lot of really good camera angles in this. A lot. I also like whenever you have like a wide shot, it's not like a full-on wide shot. It's like the camera's put in almost like a surveillance corner. Yeah. Like they're being watched the whole time, which they think they are. Because when they go down into the workroom to talk about how the shuttle did, or the flying saucer in this case, he turns on the equipment to stop any kind of people from listening in. Yeah, so perhaps that was the whole point of that camera angle, is it actually is a surveillance camera and they are being watched. Yeah,
it's got a very Big Brother feel to it before sort of the term Big Brother was even part of the lexicon. Yeah, so it really. It has that sense of foreboding and paranoia all throughout, and the stakes are high the entire time, so it never loses you.
Yeah, and this is a time for transition, not only for the show, but also the decade. I mean, obviously we're moving into the 60s, but we're quickly moving out of the Eisenhower era and moving into this idea that government may not be your best friend. And of course, Kennedy's going to combat that a little bit, but we're going to get right back into it in the late 60s and 70s.
Yeah, absolutely. I really I really appreciated the performances in this episode because, for me, just the whole Sturka family, I think, worked together as a unit. The three actors, it didn't come across as sort of your typical Leave It to Beaver type family. They seemed very natural and and it was how a father would talk to a daughter or a husband would talk to a wife. And I think the writing by Serling in this episode was very natural and realistic, which sometimes even for Twilight Zone wasn't always the case.
Yeah, I agree. So what are some of the scenes that stood out for you that you liked?
I really like, you know, I like the scene where Will Sturka is talking to his wife Eve, and he's sort of explaining to her, you know, the whole, we've got, this is going to happen tomorrow, and we've got to get out of here. And just the way that he's laying it down, because he's also laying it down for us, because we don't really understand a whole lot what's going on. We've seen the sort of pre-shadowing in the first scene between him and Carling, which is a great scene too. But yeah, I love the whole sequence when both families are sort of plotting out, the whole plan of what they're going to do later that night, and Carling shows up and they're trying to avoid him and everything. There's just a lot of really great suspenseful scenes that just happen naturally. They aren't they don't have any sort of big outlandish set piece in them. It's just humans interacting with humans and knowing what's coming, and the suspense building off of that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I love the scene around the poker table where they're again they feel like they're being watched, so they're kind of playing it up. So they're going through their bets, and it's just they're trying to put on a happy face. And at this point, Jody doesn't know what's going to happen yet, but Eve is kind of in on it. The other wife is kind of in on it. And then at the end of that scene, as Raiden is going over the coordinates and everything, kind of explaining where they're going to be going, and then Carling just kind of walks in. It's just an excellent tension builder that kind of ends in this smarmy guy coming in, walking into your house and saying, "Hey, what's up? What you doing? How's it going?"
And and props to Edward Andrews, who plays Carling, who's one of my favorite character actors from the sort of late 50s through late 60s era, because he shows up, in a ton of different movies. He shows up in things like Tora Tora Tora, and he shows up in Elvis Presley movies and Doris Day movies and a lot of Disney movies like The Absent-Minded Professor and things like that, and could play any kind of part. And to play this sort of very smarmy villain was kind of an interesting turn for him, but he plays it really, really well. And he's just got one of those unforgettable faces that, just really nobody else had at that time. And so he really fits this part well.
Yeah, and that's one of the things with him too is I don't have the history that you have in these films and everything else, but I definitely recognized him. I also recognized Sturka. I've seen him in quite a few things. I'm not entirely sure what I've seen him in, but I did recognize that actor a lot too.
Yeah, Fritz Weaver, he was also a big sort of, I think he did a lot of theater around this time, but he later did a lot of movies. I think he's in Marathon Man with Dustin Hoffman and stuff like that.
I think it's his voice too that kind of,
yeah,
that kind of deep voice, and that's what kind of reminds me of him.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that didn't work for you?
Trying to think, this episode to me was really, really pretty solid. It's interesting because it's a very solid episode, yet it doesn't quite, for me, stand out like some of the episodes that I've given the highest marks, 2 10s or things like that. Just a really, really solid outing. I really, I think maybe the only thing that didn't work for me was, and it's the plot, and it has to happen, when they're, they sort of were able to get onto the flying saucer a little too easily. They were able to throw just the right punches and get all the guys, and it was just sort of, you would think there was more security around there, but that was the only thing I thought about during this episode.
One of the things that, after I realized again what the twist was, one of the interesting things that kind of tells you that there's something up is their car sounds electric. It has no
Yeah.
real engine sound to it. But one of the things that I enjoyed the Dutch angles through most of it, and I said that the camera work was really good.
Mhm.
When they're cruising in that car and it shows the same 3 shots about 5 or 6 times,
Yeah.
they could have done a little bit different, because they're going from the house to the airfield, and you see them like, it's all crooked and they're all like foreboding and stuff, and that's fine.
Yeah.
And then they take out Carling, and we already know the flying saucer is maybe 5 feet away. I mean, it's right there. You can see it. And then they get in the car and they do the same kind of shots again. I'm just like, guys, you didn't have to do that. But I'm really just nitpicking at a good episode at this point.
Yeah, and like I said, I really didn't, once after the episode was over and I thought about the title, I'm like, well, of course, Third from the Sun. But I really didn't see that Earth twist. I said, okay, something's going to happen after they leave, and I couldn't figure it out. But then when the whole Earth thing happened, I thought, well, of course, but that was, really, really clever, and a really clever, commentary on, the sort of whole, paranoia that was going on in the country at the time and everything, and about how, here we were so paranoid on Earth, and yet this is the place they're escaping to get away from all that stuff. But,
yeah, and this is kind of my closing piece, but I think we're getting close to that point anyway. One of the things I really like, and we're going to hear it when you give Rod's closing narration, is he doesn't hit us over the head with this. It isn't, and this could happen to us. It is the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. And the fact that these guys are rushing to get off a planet, and it is us that they're trying to get to while we're in the middle of trying to screw ourselves up too. And I think that still, it holds a lot of weight to this day. One of the jokes in, I guess it's kind of really dark humor, but one of the jokes that I hear a lot from astronomers is they doubt we'll ever run into alien life because the aliens want nothing to do with us. I think it's we always have a problem as humans that we can come up with so many different ways to kill ourselves, and we don't realize that unless we can find a planet 11 million miles away, which, by the way, isn't that far away, but it's definitely not a different sun. But I'll give it to him since we haven't really had manned space flight yet. But we don't have an out. We don't have any place to go. So when we really, really screw this planet up, we're gonna have to deal with it, and our kids are gonna have to deal with it. So this escapism and the idea that you can run away at the last minute, it's not gonna happen. So we got to make sure if a crazy guy is gonna hit the button, that we make sure we're not gonna let him hit the button. So what are your kind of closing thoughts on this one? I know we're kind of rushing through it, but there's not much negative to talk about.
No, a really, really solid outing. We're here sort of in the, this, I'm looking at the date here, this was January 8th of 1960, so we're in the very, very middle of season 1, and, Rod has finally found his groove, I feel like. He's got, we say he's got about 5 or 6 plots that he likes to use over and over again, but he's starting to find new ways and interesting ways to showcase them, and it's starting to be shot a lot more cinematically, and the budgets are getting higher, and the actors he's using are more interesting, and so really, really, it's interesting watching them, as I've said, in succession the way that we are, because we've seen now a lot of quality shows in a row, and so an episode as good as this still doesn't quite stand out because we've seen such high quality. So maybe if we watch this out of order, it would be, as I said, a really, really good, solid episode, and yet I've seen others that might be a little higher. But maybe if I'd seen this out of order or something, I would rave even higher about it. But just a really, really good, solid episode.
Yeah, and I understand where you're coming from. I go a little bit farther, and I'll do this when we get to our scores. But I think this is one of the better ones. This is when I was freaking out a few episodes ago because I thought I broke my scale. When I peeked ahead, I realized, like, oh, I forgot about some of these really good ones coming up. So I think this is a nice little, you know, I've said it before, when you're doing a show like this, you only have a certain amount of budget. So this is one of those cheap episodes. I mean, you have not so many actors. The Ministry of Science is really just a power plant where they probably just asked them to open the gate and let them put all these scientists in there as they're walking out, and a couple sets, and that was about it. So when you don't have much to show for budget, you got to make up for it in story and in acting and in characters. And some of the best episodes of Twilight Zone are that. And one of the best episodes of Twilight Zone is literally 4 people in a bucket. So, but that's for another season.
And like you were saying, you know, he's sort of spreading out his budget because the next 2 episodes coming up are big location shoots.
Yes.
And so so this was very much confined to the studio, and yet, you know, good writing always rules the day. And so that's why this episode is one of the better ones that we've seen.
Agreed. So let's go ahead and get to our scores. So again, as we always do, we score 1 through 10, and this is based on other episodes of Twilight Zone. So a 5 is an average episode, a 1 is Bewitching Pool, and 10 is the best, the best of the best for Twilight Zone. I keep making fun of Bewitching Pool. The sad thing is we're not even going to get to talk about it for another 3 years. So Moose and Squirrel. So Brandon, where would you put Third from the Sun on a scale of 1 to 10?
Third from the Sun would be for me a solid 8. Solid 8. I think that it's one of the better ones we've seen. It's better than the majority of the ones we've seen, and yet the ones that I've given 9s and 10s to just have that little bit of, whether it be Jeremy's favorite word, iconic, or whether it be just ones that leave you saying wow at the end of them. And so this is one of those better solid episodes, but just not quite that high mark for me.
Yeah, my highest one so far has been Walking Distance, which I gave an 8. I'm going to give this one an 8 as well. I think it's on the same par, and I like it, again, as I mentioned, just because of the acting and the story, but I also like the fact that this is one of the ones where you could show it to a bunch of kids in the classroom today and they would understand and get the theme, because the theme continues, which is, as I already mentioned, kind of depressing that it's still a theme that hits well with us. But 60 years later, over 60 years later, we still have the same issues. And so I think this is still a story that needs to be told. So I like it quite a bit.
Absolutely.
So, Brandon, before we start plugging, let's finish up with what Rod had to say at the end.
Sure. Behind a tiny ship heading into space is a doomed planet on the verge of suicide. Ahead lies a place called Earth, the third planet from the sun. And for William Sturka and the men and women with him, it's the eve of the beginning in the Twilight Zone.
So we want to thank you again for checking out Zone-i-Sodes, and this is our 14th episode of the Twilight Zone. Next week we'll be talking about throwing an arrow up in the air, just much like a lawn dart. So you can check out all of our previous episodes at thefrontrowmoviereviews.com. If you're watching us on YouTube, please make sure to like and subscribe so you can keep an eye on us and help us get up, move up on those search engines. If you're listening to us on your podcast app of choice, please make sure you subscribe to us there as well. And check out our other shows. Brandon has his classics, and Brandon, you just dropped another one here, I believe, last week.
Yeah, actually about TV. The TV from 2017.
Yeah, a very classic episode.
But the subject all about the golden age of Hollywood. So Jeremy and I had an interesting discussion on that one. We talked about Ryan Murphy's miniseries Feud that aired earlier this year, all about the making of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane and the rivalry between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. So check it out. Interesting stuff. And
I have my flashbacks. We just dropped Aliens. Some thought it was Alien, but it was Aliens. In lead up for Alien Covenant, which will be, actually is already out. It opened tonight. We're recording on a Thursday. And so again, you can check all that out at thefrontrowmoviereviews.com. You can also get a hold of us anytime at thefrontrowmoviereviews@gmail.com. Let us know what your favorite Twilight Zone episode is. Let us know how you would like to see this show go. We are, believe it or not, Brandon, we are 9%. I'm actually kind of rounding up a little bit, but we are 9% through the Twilight Zone.
We're almost to double digits.
Well, until next time, I'm Scott McFarland, and with me, as always,
Brandon Davis.
And we will see you on the couch. Have a good night, or day, or whatever you're listening to us. And hopefully it's not the eve of destruction when you are listening to us.
Hopefully not.
If it is, hopefully it's been a good ride. That's all I got.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Zone-i-Sodes. Zone-i-Sodes is a special presentation of the Front Row Movie Reviews podcast. For more information, go to www.thefrontrowmoviereviews.com.